Hey guys, welcome back to my Coco Chanel. Let's talk about that recent interview with Yoshinori Kitase and Tetsuya Nomura regarding Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So I found this information on DualShockers.com. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is massive, will keep the original's feel as much as possible. Here's a quote from Yoshinori Kitase: "The game does not heavily deviate from the original and will procure you the same feelings as the original. The Midgar we made in Final Fantasy VII Remake was a result of trying to make it satisfying for fans of the original. In the same way, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will not break the image of the original so dear to fans." So here's the thing. I recently made a video questioning whether or not Zack is alive or dead. You know, I still think it's up in the air. Some people are convinced that he's alive. Some people aren't so sure. Others are convinced that he's dead. There were some comments left on my previous videos that are really great points, that point to him possibly being alive, probably being alive. I'm not sure. But then I read a quote like this: "This game does not heavily deviate from the original." That's something my brain cannot process because, as I said many times before, Zack's, spoiler alert by the way, spoiler alert, Zack's death in the original game is a huge plot point. It's the impetus of Cloud and his loss of sense of self and identity and his kind of self-identity crisis, that it's the impetus for the whole game. So when I see a quote that says Rebirth will not heavily deviate from the original, Zack being alive to me is heavily deviating from the original. I could be wrong. You know, another possibility, the developers could be lying to us. That's another possibility. In which case, the third game in this project should be called Final Fantasy VII Liars. I don't think they would be lying to us because I think a lot of fans would be upset at that. But at the same time, you know, I know they're trying to give a game that will be surprising to fans of the original game and new fans to the franchise. So they want to be surprising, and I don't think they would lie to us, but I don't know. It's a difficult balance for the developers to attain. Here's a quote from Tetsuya Nomura. "Some of you are worried, wondering if 3 games will be enough or if it'll be like a sped up version of the original. It won't, so please don't worry about it. Needless to say, the same feeling of freedom you had after leaving Midgar in the original will be there. I believe you'll actually be surprised at how much we managed to include in the game." I don't think Rebirth or the third game will be sped up versions of the original. I still think it's very surprising that Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1 is just Midgar. And for those of you who have played the original game, Midgar is maybe 5 to 6 hours of the original game. And the whole game, let's just give an average about 60 hours of the game. 60 hours to complete the whole original game. So if you take 5 hours minus 60 hours, simple math, it's 55 hours. 55 hours divided by 2, let's say 56 hours. 26 hours of the original game dedicated to both Part 2 and Part 3 of this game. So how is Midgar 5 hours of the original game and then 26 hours for Part 2 and Part 3? It doesn't seem to make sense. I trust the developers, of course, that they're not going to give us sped up versions of the game, but it does seem weird. And at one point, like reading through these interviews, they said they might have wanted to do 2 parts, which to me would have seemed even more insane. Square Enix won't cut content and locations from the original Final Fantasy VII. Here's another quote from Tetsuya Nomura. The story's main frame remains unchanged. As for the newly added mysteries, these will be intriguing even for those familiar with the original game. However, seeing the changes that the remake trilogy brings to the table, a portion of the story will progress differently than in the original game. When you get to play Rebirth, you might be led to believe that certain locations from the original game were cut. However, our policy during development is to avoid cutting any content from the original. And it's simply that you'll visit certain locations and experience certain events in a different order than in the original. So that sounds pretty interesting. So we might visit different locations in a different order. This doesn't necessarily confirm that the next game will be open world or not. And like I've said in previous videos, the original wasn't really open world. You know, after you left Midgar, there was still a specific order of locations that you had to visit and certain like vehicles that you had to get, and then the world became larger and larger as the game progressed. But it's interesting to see that the game is going to progress in a different order from the original. Here are some highlights that I found on gematsu.com. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth can be enjoyed sufficiently on its own. The reason for the delay in announcing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was we were not sure whether it would be a two-part work or trilogy. They've already begun work on areas such as the plot and scenario for the third title. Just as we created Midgar so that fans of the original Final Fantasy VII can appreciate it, we're taking care to develop Rebirth as not to ruin the image that fans have of the original. For that reason, the volume is quite massive. As for whether the game will be open world or not, that will be announced with the next information release. The scene in which Cloud and Sephiroth are walking together in the trailer is a Cloud flashback scene. The focal point of the story hasn't been changed. As for the new mysteries that differ from the original Final Fantasy VII, players of the original will be able to enjoy the game in a new way. The challenge we tackled for this project was how to include those new mysteries without deviating from the original. Regarding game progression, there will be some changes. If while you're playing you think, was this cut? It's because the structure of the story has changed a bit due to the nature of it being a trilogy. Although the order in which you visit some places may change, our policy is essentially not to cut anything. The sources for this information include 4gamer.net, Dengenki Online, Famitsu, and Gamer. Now that we know that Final Fantasy VII Remake is going to be a trilogy, it's interesting to think where Rebirth might end. I made a prediction video a while ago saying that Part 2 will end at Cosmo Canyon. Obviously, that was before we knew this was going to be a trilogy, and we didn't know how many parts it was going to be. I should go back and try to reevaluate that opinion and see where Rebirth might end. Definitely let me know what you guys think about this recent news, about these interviews. I hope you guys are doing well. I hope your current job doesn't cause you to go down a spiral of depression and death. And if it is, try to find something new maybe. Thanks for watching, and say hi to your pets for me. You know, I recently watched Jurassic World Dominion. It wasn't great. But surprisingly, I didn't hate Chris Pratt as much as I usually do. I showered for this video, but I didn't brush my teeth. Who has time to do both? You can't have it both ways. Just like Zack, he can't be alive and dead. Or could he?